What type of mindset and psychology is required to be a successful entrepreneur? Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Today I've got Ben. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today.
Great to be here, Alfie.
Awesome. So let's go straight into it, man. You co-founded the language learning platform Memrise, which now has scaled to 70 plus million users. That's absolutely insane. What tips would you give to others that are looking to build or maybe start a tech company of their own?
Great and very broad question. I guess how to answer that one without getting confused by where you're starting. I think working out, and what I didn't know at the time when we founded Memrise, I was very much solving my own problem. I had struggled with language learning at school. I'd done fine on my exams, but I knew I couldn't speak Spanish. I knew I couldn't speak French. I certainly couldn't speak Latin.
Yeah.
And I then had got very into neural networks and in particularly building neural networks to try and predict horse race results, something that I never actually got good enough at to make any money. But it got me very interested in the process. This is a very roundabout answer to your question. In the process of training neural networks and how they work. Through that, I got into studying neuroscience and really studying how human brains work. And that led me to this problem, or looking more closely at this problem that I'd had, that I was crap at learning languages, or so I thought. But then it occurred to me that the way I'd been taught languages was not the way that I would train a neural network. And if I believed that my brain was a neural network, which I broadly do, then why was I not training it in the same way? And so the way I was taught languages was learn a bunch of words, learn their translations, and then learn some rules, and then apply those rules to those words, which is more a kind of how you program a computer to try and speak a language rather than how you train a neural network. And I think what we see in generative AI now is that actually the best way to get a computer to speak a language is doing it like a human. But anyway, I felt I was being programmed like a computer to learn a language rather than being leaning into the way that my brain, being a human brain, naturally spots patterns in inputs and then makes predictions about the best way to give an output. So that was the problem that I was trying to solve, and set up Memrise to try and give myself the kind of what I felt was the support I needed in order to correctly train my brain to be able to speak another language, rather than to give it the teaching content that would let me pass an exam in a language. So how does that go back to the advice to people starting a company? I think understanding, doing a lot of things a lot better than we did. I'll come on to what I think we did well in a moment, but I think the things that we didn't do well, I was just solving a problem for myself. I didn't take any effort to go out and see if this was a broader problem that people were having. I just had a statement of belief on it. I think we were very lucky that we got one thing extremely right, which was that we identified very early on that a switch to mobile was happening, a platform switch from websites to mobile. We weren't fast enough to execute on that. It took us literally 3 years to build our first mobile app from the point when we knew that it was the right thing to do. And that was because we didn't have the technical expertise to do it, and probably didn't have the level of conviction in backing our judgment that we should have had. And that was why Duolingo got out with a mobile app 2 years before us, which the rest is history. But what we did get right, we were right enough on mobile. We were in early enough in the growth of the mobile platform to grow with that. And I think also we understood how to get a growth channel really working for us. In our case, it was the app stores, and understanding, particularly with Google, how to, in those days, the developer representatives, their job was to, they looked good to their boss if they could evidence that they were making more money for developers. So rather than treating it as a sales job where we had to try and sell to our developer relations person to get a featuring. We realized that we needed to show her that she'd done her job well and give her data and presentations that demonstrated that she was adding value to us, because that's what made her job easy and made it easy for her to promote us. And I think we did that very, very well. So back to the advice, I think really understanding a market need better than we did, but then also really understand that growth vector. And understanding, I think, is something that founders give up too early, is um, thinking they can outsource growth to somebody else, hire ahead of marketing, hire ahead of growth. It's so foundational to the business. Like the point of a startup is a company really that grows exponentially. And if you don't understand, if you're not going to discover the vector of exponential growth, then you're outsourcing the absolute heart of your company to somebody else. And
Yeah.
the chances of you doing that well are very, very small.
Sure. And you've seen that across a wide variety of businesses, because as well as building Memrise, you've also invested in 50 plus other companies, right? From AI to climate tech and beyond. What's important to you, Ben, when investing? You know, what makes an investable founder and business?
Yeah, a really, really good and difficult question, because it is, when looking at a business, it's almost impossible to stop yourself from evaluating the business in its current state. Um, but that for very early stage businesses is not going to be helpful. Like the what they end up being successful with will be different to what they have now. And it's actually a balance that entrepreneurs have to hold, a difficult balance that we have to hold as entrepreneurs, is that you need a vision of what you're building and what excites you, because that's what gets you out of bed in the morning. And it's what allows you to motivate a team. It allows you to motivate investors, get everyone excited. This is the vision of what I'm building. But you have to also hold very clearly in your mind that you are definitely wrong. That is definitely not what you're building. If you fall into the mistake of building the thing that you have a vision of, then you end up building something that no one wants, because you're not listening to your customers enough. And I've had this several founders that I mentor. I mentor through companies that I invest in, but I also mentor through a couple of different programs. And I've had several founders come onto those programs who've already invested their life savings in trying to build an app. They had a vision of what they wanted to build, and they put their life savings into building it. And the problem that you see there is that apps never work. Like when you build an app, it's actually a much more complicated system than you think. And the first version of it, it's not going to work. But when you've built a whole app as your first thing, you also don't know why it doesn't work. You don't know if you've just got the wrong users coming in. And if you've got the right users coming in, it would work perfectly well. You don't know if there's a bug in the Facebook login, which is causing it to break. You don't know if there's weird redirects happening in certain situations that you weren't expecting. Or you don't know if you just built the wrong thing. And that's why uh, the process that you need to identify early is a founder who can hold in mind, they can inspire people about their current vision and inspire themselves, but they realize that what they're building out is not an execution roadmap to build that thing. It is a discovery roadmap of how do I de-risk this path. And so seeing that, the way that I look for this in companies is I tend to work with companies for a while, 4, 5, 6 meetings before I invest in them. And I want to see that direction of movement. Like, are these founders people who can do that balancing act, can get excited about an inspirational vision, but at the same time can listen to their customers enough to see, how am I wrong? It's not even am I wrong? Is my vision wrong? It's enthusiastically embrace how can I find out in what ways I am wrong so that I can correct it? And it is that speed of learning which is ultimately predictive of whether you're going to be successful or not. It's kind of like in the growth process, like when you're running a growth process within a company, your growth experiments will normally fail. Typically you need to run 50, 60 experiments before you alight on something that really works well. If on every experiment that fails, all you learn is, crap, that didn't work, then you're just taking 50 shots in the dark, and
Mm.
you're not going to hit the target. So the crucial thing when running growth experiments is to see if this experiment fails, and you do this in advance, if this experiment fails, what am I going to learn? And if you're not going to learn anything, then it's almost not worth doing the experiment because you can't afford to just taking shots in the dark. So then you need to restructure the experiment a bit so that you learn. And if you're learning on each experiment, then after 50 experiments, you're going to have learned a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
And you're going to be in a very, very much better place. And it is that kind of incremental over time that will actually change the arc of where the company is going. So what I look for is a founder that displays those kinds of abilities. And that can mean that the actual company that you end up building is completely different.
Yeah.
But it's all built on that same core skill.
You said something similar to that on a different podcast you did a while back. It was the Getting into IT podcast. You said that the more that you reduce risk when investing, the more average the thing that you are doing is. And I love that, because if you're not going for like moonshots, you're not going for something big and brave and ambitious, then what's the point? Like you might want to, it's investing, right? You're going for to build disruptive
Right. And,
platforms.
yeah, well, particularly it's early stage investing. And,
Correct.
and this is not, we're not trying to normalize returns
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
You are trying to find the outside one. And it is interesting that is the investment process there is very similar to the growth process when you're running a startup, in that it is a search, not an execution. And you are trying to search for the companies that are really great. And that's why I'm happy to spend time with founders before investing, because it's like that gives the due diligence I'm trying to do is, are these people going to operate in a way that is going to learn over time and get progressively better over time, rather than, is this a good idea? You know, when I see investors doing things like due diligence on ROI calculations for 3 years out, and you're just like, seriously, the product's not even going to be the same. What are you
Sure.
even
Yeah.
thinking of?
Yeah.
And I do see that even early stage investors, it's writing posts on LinkedIn about how they support, how they're looking for great founders. And then those same investors I see writing rejection letters to pre-seed founders on the basis of ROI calculations. And
Mm.
it's very hard to do, but it does require an investment of time. But in my mind, if I invest 6 hours over 6 weeks having conversations about a growth process and customer development process, that's much less than I might have to invest in doing a traditional due diligence process, but
Yeah.
actually gets right to the heart of the due diligence that you need to do, which is more on the approach and abilities of the founder.
Okay. Well, we've talked advice there on building a business, a startup, investing in early stage businesses. Hey, this podcast is brought to you by welovealpha.com. If you're looking to grow and hire and scale your software engineering team in the UK, then go to welovealpha.com to hire the best software developers on the market. Everything across Java to C# to PHP to Python to React and Angular and mobile and more. Go to welovealpha.com to hire the best software engineers in the UK now. Let me get your advice on writing, because one of my favorite ways of building mindset is through reading books. I read a little bit of your book, Black Dragon River, which I appreciate you wrote a long, long time ago, but I thought the writing was excellent. And there was a story in there about how you almost got drunkenly tricked into a teaching job in China for like £25 a month or something crazy. I appreciate you did write this quite a while ago, but
God, you've really done your research, Alfie.
always, man. I run a recruiting business, right? So we have to do deep research on people before we work with them or represent candidates. So it's just in my DNA, to be honest, Ben. But if people are interested in perhaps writing, whether that's a book or a blog or a Substack or whatever, you seem to have a really good way with structure and format and telling a story. Are there any tips that you'd give to people when it comes to that side of the coin?
You flatter me. I actually don't think it. I don't think it's something I do well in terms of long form writing.
Mm.
So Black Dragon River was very much so when I was living in Heilongjiang province in northeastern China, and actually just it started out as just a writing practice where I was just writing to my girlfriend most days. Um, Video calls weren't really a thing
Yeah, yeah.
back then, and so I was just writing these long form emails about what was going on, and I got very into the practice of just writing every day, which any writing advice ever has said, write every day, a little bit every day. And that's probably my strongest experience of doing that for a prolonged period. Um, in terms of structuring things, I mean, the area where I do a lot of structuring is in pitch decks. Um, and that's probably where I have my creative writing outlet most strongly at the moment, is in how to put together compelling pitch decks. And that I the way I work with a pitch deck is to start just with 10 bullet points
Mm.
and try and work out what is the 10 bullet point story that actually holds this all together, and then build the slides off the bullet points. Um, I've tried other ways around. I'm not a very visual person as well. I know a lot of people can't think unless they have like mind maps and all of these things. I do bullet point lists.
Okay.
That's how I work. And what I find by structuring that, I can hold 10 bullet points in my mind and I can see how that whole thing flows together. And I can see if there's anything that is a little bit catches and is not quite as slick as it could be. And then building out of those, you've got your titles for each of your 10 slides. And you know that investors are going to spend probably 3 minutes looking at your deck. And therefore, it's a few seconds each slide. They're going to read the headline and then get a bit of a feel for a picture. And if it can't be compelling in 10 bullet points, then the deck is very unlikely to be compelling as well. So that's how I guess that's where I'm looking at structure most these days.
What are the non-negotiable categories in a pitch deck for you? You know, problem, solution, team, whatever. What are like the top deal breakers which you need to see if you're going to invest in a business?
I I think that there's no generic answer to that, except that they need to be making a strong case and then having the evidence for that case. And so if the evidence you're making is that this is a very um, difficult problem to solve, which no one else has the expertise to solve, then your team slide becomes incredibly important, because your team slide needs to say, look, we're the people to solve this. So the company I'm working with at the moment that has a solution for a diagnostic AI tool for doctors that helps with prescribing metabolic oncology treatments,
Mm.
personalized cancer treatments. And the problem there is that although supplementary metabolic treatments are hugely effective in treating cancer, they prescribing the right one is a very difficult thing to do. It requires an encyclopedic knowledge of huge numbers of drugs. There are only tens of people globally who've got that expertise, and for each one of those, it takes them hours and hours and hours to do the prescription. Per patient, takes 6-7 hours to analyze all of the data.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. The team is one of the world's top metabolic oncologists, top AI engineer who's built and exited multiple AI machine learning companies, and a top writer and operator in the metabolic oncology space. So it's like, okay, that is a big problem. This is the team to fix it. That's because that's the particular case that they're making. If I look at another company that comes to mind, Gaia, who are making software to help complex demanufacturing recycling processes. So
Okay.
EV batteries are an example of complex demanufacturing.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
a totally different kind of recycling that requires a totally different kind of product. Now, no one is a perfect product market, founder market fit for that product because it literally hasn't existed before.
Mm.
So what they need to demonstrate, the team slide needs to show they've got experience and they've got one of the co-founders has a lot of experience working with ERP tools, the other one with enterprise sales. But what they need to show is this is a problem that a large number and a rapidly growing number of recyclers have, and they will be willing to take on our solution quickly. And so the evidence there, so they make the case. This is a plausible change in the world. If I say to you, recycling is changing and becoming more about complex demanufacturing than about simple crushing things up recycling.
Mm.
You could be like, well, sounds plausible. I know that there are loads of EVs coming out. I can imagine that there's more electronic material and there are lots of regulations. Sounds plausible. But until you've actually got data that says, therefore, these people are actually buying the material. So for Gaia, the point at which we raised investment for them first as just an angel round was where they'd spoken to 12 battery recyclers, and 9 of those had said, yes, we want the product. And in 3 of those, one of the C-level executives had invested money themselves in
Okay.
Gaia.
Okay.
And so that was a trigger. So the story we were telling then was saying, look, this is a really intense pain point. You may not understand it, but it is an intense pain point. Look, the people who have it don't just buy it for their company, they invest in our company. And so that's a different one. So I think you need a very compelling narrative, and then you need the evidence that supports that narrative and tells that story.
Sure. Let me ask you a little bit about the future, because you co-founded the NFT project Angry Teenagers. Great name, by the way, which plants trees and fights climate change, using the blockchain. Now, NFTs, in my eyes, appear to have gone from this exciting new trend to now JPEGs of apes and that sort of thing. So it's cool to see you doing something unique and actually impactful in that space. But what are your thoughts on NFTs and I guess the future of the blockchain?
We started actually building around the Angry Teenagers before NFTs as digital artworks were a thing. So what we were interested by was that having a token that was non-fungible meant that we could solve what we perceived to be a very specific customer problem, which is this, that carbon credits have been a kind of business level solution to reaching net zero. But for individuals, basically there is no consumer market for buying carbon credits. And we felt that the reason for that was that there was a lack of trust and there was a sort of perception you need a lot of expertise to understand where carbon credits come from, what they're doing, and therefore to judge between them. And we thought that if you could sell a token that was specifically geolocated to a particular piece of land where trees were growing, then you always had visibility of your piece of land that was generating your carbon credits, and you could see all the kind of research about that. But you could have a real connection to that piece of land. So we wanted to have tokens that could be tradable and sellable on a market, but that are non-fungible, and each one is uniquely linked to a piece of land. So that was where we started with non-fungible tokens. Then at some point during the journey, NFT came to mean something completely different that was sort of not particularly related to the idea of non-fungibility, but was just like a digital artwork. So that was kind of confusing moment where we were trying to sell something that was an NFT, but had nothing to do with digital art. I think what we learned, and through that project, we created this forest reforestation project in Ghana, 200-hectare project. There was a kind of pilot of this, and it geolocated a bunch of tokens to that. The thing that I really learned through that was that although it's true that individual consumers are not buying carbon credits and aren't taking action in the way that they could. Theoretically, there is a pool of capital that could be unlocked there to go into reforestation. What I really learned through the process was that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck to mass scale reforestation, and particularly I'm talking in Africa and South America. Those are the two places in the world. If you look in the Northern Hemisphere and China are more forested now than they were 100 years ago. You know, we've dramatically increased. China has really dramatically increased forest cover in the last 100 years. But Sub-Saharan Africa, well, actually just Central Africa and South America is the problem. And those are the places that we need to change. But the problem is not money going in. The problem is people actually going out there and doing the work on the ground. And that is identifying the places, it's working with the communities, it's structuring a project with the communities in a way that benefits the communities locally, so that they will keep growing those forests and keep protecting those forests and not chop them down again in 10 years because they were chopped down because the near-term benefit for the local community was to chop the forest down. So if you plant another forest and don't solve that problem, the forest isn't going to stay there. So ultimately on that, we've actually, the Angry Teenagers is like, it is still there, trees are still there, but it's not a project that I'm going to actively push into growing at the moment. We've spun out of that a company called Three Trees that was run by the guys that were doing, that were doing the actual on the ground reforestation project in Ghana. They are now turning that into a mass scale project. They've got tens of thousands of hectares under contract to reforest, and they are doing, and they've created both a technical and a community platform to do that, to unlock that at massive scale. And it's how you work with those local communities to be able to plant these forests in a way that they're going to stay around for a long time. So I think the future there it's going to be more innovation in the actually planting, growing forests, working with communities to do that, and less so in the crypto space.
Yeah. I love the underlying fundamental technology of the blockchain and NFTs. I envision a world where every receipt is an NFT, every concert ticket is an NFT, rather than just focusing on JPEGs of, apes or something, right? Which is cool, but it's not quite the potential of the technology, as opposed to something like what you were doing in that example. Well, where did the name Angry Teenagers come from?
It actually came because it was what the genesis of actually starting to do it was I went on I took two of my two eldest daughters on a trip to Japan where we were I also where we were talking about all of these things one evening in the mountains. I'd also slightly weirdly forced both of them at aged 13 and 11 to read a book called The Ecology of Money that is quite an obtuse regenerative economics book published in the late 90s by an economist called Richard Douthwaite. And his thesis there is that the value creation behind any major international currency, if you follow it back far enough, is based on extractive practices from the earth. So whether that's mining, whether it's oil, whether it's chopping down forests. And as international trade grows, that will grow further and will destroy more of the planet. Unless we create, this is his theory, unless we create an international reserve currency based on carbon credits. And so the idea was that if, in order to do more international trade, you need to buy a currency that is only created when carbon is captured, then international trade is aligned with reducing carbon dioxide and with preserving the forests of the world and therefore biodiversity. So he was quite early, that was in 2000. I think he wrote in 94, actually. And so I'd forced my two daughters to read this. We were discussing that and kind of why isn't that happening? What gets in the way of that? And they were getting quite angry about the need for this. And, as many younger generation are still, I feel, and I actually felt like I had been angry about this when I was a teenager, and at some point I just got used to it. I
Mm.
got used to the fact that the planet was completely f***ed and that I wasn't doing anything about it, and I was busy teaching people each other's languages. And although Memrise was very much a sort of mission-driven startup, I think that holiday with those two in Japan did was a kind of turning point for me where I felt that angry teenage energy. I wanted to like reproduce that, and then it became a bit of an internal joke, and
Yeah,
we
yeah, yeah.
created some artwork because that was NFTs. But that was really where the name came from.
Cool. Angry teenage Ben. I love it. As well as Web3, you love AI. I heard you obviously mentioned it earlier in the pod, but I heard this on a different episode you did on somebody else's show where you were building neural networks as a teenager to try to predict the outcome of horse races. What are your thoughts on the future of artificial intelligence? Are we going to see AGI anytime soon? Is it going to be the end of the world? What are your thoughts on, I guess, the future of AI?
Uh, I can't pretend to be able to learn that far. I can create a neural network to predict a horse race. Like predicting the future of AI is a much trickier piece to do. But I guess I can look along the particular tracks where I'm working. I can peek a little bit further down the line there. And I guess within education, I think it's um, something that I'm excited about in education is that exams have been the kind of bane of education forever, I think. And within language education, we've got this preposterous situation where I can get an A in GCSE French, and I know that I can't have a conversation. Like I know that I can't even do the basics. I could when I lived in Beijing first, when I'd moved down from Qitiehar, where I wrote Black Dragon River, I was visited by some friends who'd studied Chinese at Oxford. And when they arrived, I had to help them get a taxi from the airport because they couldn't even talk to the taxi driver. And it's this sort of absurd breakdown. They'd passed exams, finals exams in Chinese at Oxford, and they couldn't tell a taxi driver how to get to a hotel. Preposterous. I think that has been, if you think of why we have exams, why we structure exams as we do, it's really on the limiting factor of we've only got one human teacher or a small number of human teachers who need to be able to standardize marks across a whole load of students. So let's standardize the things that we ask them. Let's standardize the format of the response that we want to make it easy so we have a mark scheme. And all of that is channeling it into this sausage factory that is nothing like what we actually want to train people to be able to do. That we don't want people to be able to answer a mark scheme. We want them to be creative and solve problems of all different sorts. Now, what an AI, and I see things like AQA exam board where talking about testing using AI to moderate different examiners' marks that they were giving out. But that's like version 0.1. That's using AI to try and be slightly more efficient at doing the rubbish thing that we're doing already. What excites me is that we can now do a totally different kind of exams. On Memrise, we can already have students doing conversations in Spanish with an AI. And we can see how many mistakes they make. We can see whether their accent is good or bad. We can see how much grammar mistakes they're making. We can see how creative they are with their answers. All of those things we can right now just output. Yeah, that person is accurate and gets through the conversation, makes himself understood, but they're quite monosyllabic, very short answers, so not very exciting. To do that kind of exam without AI would require each teacher to be spending hours with each student. No one would set up that exam because it's impossible. But if we can examine like that, then it changes the way we teach. We no longer teach to see, can you answer a question on grammar structure? Because it doesn't matter. We teach you to be able to hold a 2-hour conversation in German because that's what you ultimately want to be able to do. And now that we can examine you on that skill and give a very standardized and accurate way of measuring, can you do that thing, that is totally scalable to millions of students,
Mm.
that changes how we can teach. And I think so. You can see that in language learning, but I think you can see that across um, pretty much any industry, that the more we can create exams that are lifelike analogs of the real world and how someone is coping in those situations, the more we can align our teaching to being getting good at the actual thing we want you to do rather than being good at the exam. And I think we know intuitively that being good at exams isn't the same as being good at the real job, and yet we persist in doing it. And the more we, the UK education system at the moment is so exam and test focused from such a young age that exams become, it's the sort of tail wagging the dog, that the whole education system becomes being good at exams. But then you get to the end, and like the person who's done A-level French and still can't speak, or done a degree in Chinese and still can't talk to a taxi driver. That's really obvious in languages, but I think it's equally true in every part of our education system. You learn to do maths, and you get to the end and find that you can still fuck up your finances, even though you know the maths of it. That's just ridiculous. It's because you haven't been taught to actually use the maths in the way that you need them
Mm.
in your daily life.
Okay. We've
I'm not
talked
sure
about a
that
few.
really answered your question
No,
there,
no,
but
no,
it's a
no.
good ramble.
I guess what I'm hearing, and correct me if I've misunderstood this, Ben, but through AI, we won't necessarily be taught what to think anymore, but we'll be hopefully taught how to think, because a lot of the what, you can put it into Google now and it'll give you the
Yeah,
answer already. However, if you can develop more frameworks and ways of tackling problems and leave all the boring stuff to the AI system to come up with, then it will allow us to have more we'll be able to decide what to think or how to think rather than what to think. I'm rambling there, but does that make sense?
I no, I think yeah, I agree with that. I think they're like pressing on a really interesting area. That another way that I think about this is that during we've had several explosions in our ability as humans to access information. So the sort of for the Gutenberg press, which allowed the printed word to go, to hugely more available, and then up to the internet, where suddenly information became a million times more accessible. But weirdly, although the internet made information sort of a million times more accessible, the actual amount of learning that people did, the amount of learning that changed their ability to do things on a daily basis, probably went up like 20, 25%. An incremental improvement, but nothing like the access to the information. And I think there's this big step in an educational journey between the sort of conceptual learning and the internalizing that information in a way that it can actually change your life. Languages being
Yeah.
a really clear example of this, where you can know and you can know the vocab, you can know the grammar rule, but actually being able to hear language and meaning appears in your mind, very different thing. And you need to go through that process. And it is that it's a weird thing actually in language that
Mm.
the way that we speak, that we talk about having language and then putting it into practice. Sorry, we're doing learning and then putting it into practice. But actually, the practice bit is where we really learn to be able to do it. And this sort of dichotomy of learning and then practice. Practice is where we actually gain the ability. And I think what AI allows us to do is to take that explosion of access to information, and it gives us the tools to help people internalize that information much faster, much more effectively, and so create experiences that allow us to do really effective practice of using information, which is how we internalize it. And yeah, that's kind of talking to your point, but in a slightly different lens. Yeah.
We Let's bring this back a little bit to, I guess, business, because most people listening are entrepreneurs, are builders, are people trying to start stuff in technology. We talked about education for quite a bit there, and you're very well educated. You've got a master's degree in psychology from the University of Oxford. What type of mindset and psychology is required to be a successful entrepreneur? I appreciate that's probably not the type of psychology they were teaching you at Oxford, but as somebody who has also been to the University of Life many times, what I guess would you if you were a professor of entrepreneurship and psychology, what mindset is important when people are trying to start something and build something amazing?
Yes, I have conflicting thoughts on this because there's on one level an answer that is, you need the resilience and flexibility, that kind of that balance that I spoke about earlier of holding a clear vision and inspiring people around that vision, but also being flexible to find the best way to get there and to listen to your customers. And there is a lot of resilience because stuff is going to go wrong all the time. But I'm also kind of troubled by that because as soon as you look for, or as soon as you define things like, I want these mindset traits in entrepreneurs, I believe, and in my experience, you are unintentionally skewing the kind of people that you're saying can be entrepreneurs. And broadly towards people that looked like the people that you've seen being successful entrepreneurs, which is overwhelmingly white privileged men.
Mm,
Less becoming less so, happily, but still to an
sure.
unacceptably large degree, in my view.
Yeah.
Um, and what one of the things that I've noticed, because I'm mainly about 80% mentoring people who are from non-traditional founder backgrounds, again, very consciously. And one of the things that I notice is that although people need resilience, it's not quite a character trait. And I think we have a slightly lazy wish to make something and maybe it's to do with wanting people to be heroic, that we want to attribute things to being core parts of that person and they are like this and that makes them successful. And I feel there's a slightly more porous boundary between the person and their surroundings. And I think when um, mentoring people from non-traditional founder backgrounds, a lot of what I am doing is channeling. I like, okay, I think you can be bolder than that. I think you can be more aggressive, more ambitious. You can be more like an annoying white man like me, and more presumptuous. You can channel a bit more of that. And actually, the resilience is often there internally. It's just that people are living in a world that doesn't show them that. It doesn't respond in the same way. And I slightly rambling answer, but I guess I feel as soon as we're starting to talk about what mentalities a person has, I start to feel a little bit uncomfortable because I actually think it's a support network around everybody that is needed around everyone. And I think, I have my founder support networks where people who I speak to and have spoken to for years are going through similar journeys, hugely important to me. A lot of those people that have been important to me over the years are people who look a lot like me because that's what I find easiest to be supported by. But when you move into other founder groups, I think that having whatever works for each individual founder, having some way to be supported and feel like you are not alone on this journey, whatever that form that takes, is incredibly, incredibly powerful. So rather than looking at it as individual
Mm,
founder traits, I feel more comfortable thinking about it as what are the support networks that founders need and how can we help make those support networks a reality. And some of that support network is in mentoring and experience from people who've been through it before who can say, yeah, no, don't worry, it always fails like that. that
Yeah.
always breaks. Don't worry. Yeah, yeah, this is cool. And some of that is just emotional support. Some of that is being given permission to behave in certain ways and say, no, it is perfectly reasonable to say your company is now worth. I have to say this a lot to people, not white men, but I have to say it a lot to people where it's like, you're going out to raise an angel round. It is perfectly reasonable for you to say, given where your company is now, that it's worth 2 million or 5 million or 10 million. That's perfectly reasonable. Go
Mhm.
out and say it,
Yeah.
own it. And if you're not coming from a social group where you're surrounded by other founders who are talking about what they're raising at, it's bonkers. You're like, I've I've just had this idea and I've started working on it and I've got a tiny bit of traction. How can I go and say to someone it's worth £2 million? It's insane. But you need to be given that permission to say, no, that is actually, it's perfectly reasonable to say that.
Yeah.
It, yeah, as long as you have created something of real value. But
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate the answer. It's probably very different to what most people answer that question with. Usually they just talk about, vision, hard work, persistence, all important, but the support network, the community, just as important. I agree with you. What about for people that have enjoyed this, Ben, if they want to find out more about you, more about Memrise, is there anywhere in particular they should go to?
I guess connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very happy to chat. Love meeting founders. As I say, happy to support people on the journey. So please do, yeah, get in touch directly. It's probably the best way.
Cool. I'll put your LinkedIn on the screen. Amazing. Well, thank you so
Amazing.
much for coming on.
All right, thanks, Alfie. Great to be here.
Hey, thanks for watching this podcast. Make sure that you like, subscribe, follow, comment, etc., etc., and I'll see you in the next episode.